Good afternoon, folks. Now, today's discussion is the title is Death is Not what most people think it is. Okay, we're going to go through that for today's B. I've made a little presentation for you. Please enjoy. End of life workers, hospice nurses, palliative care physicians, social workers describe a reality that is quieter, slower, more psychological, and more human than the dramatic final moments portrayed in movies. What we get wrong about death comes from distance. Modern life keeps us far from dying people. So when so so we finally encounter the process, we misread what is normal, what is natural, and what is actually compassionate. Below is a long narrative style essay that weaves together the insights of end of life workers with the emotional, cultural, and practical misunderstandings families often carry. Okay, guys, here you go. What we get wrong about death, a narrative essay through the eyes of end of life workers like myself. So here we go. Death rarely arrives. The death rarely arrives the way we imagine it. Ask the people who sit at the bedside day after day, hospice nurses adjusting pillows, palliative, palliative physicians explaining breathing changes, social workers guiding families through anticipatory grief, and they will tell you that the final chapter of life is not a single moment, but a landscape. It has terrain, weather, and rhythm. It has its own language, and most of us enter it without a map. The myth of the movie Death. Popular culture has given us a script. A loved one whispers a final sentence, closes their eyes, and slips away in seconds. But end of life workers say this is almost never how dying unfolds. Natural death is a process, not an event. The body lets go gradually, breathing slows and becomes irregular. Skin cools and molds. Responsiveness fades. Families often panic at these signs, believing something is wrong, when in truth, these changes are not. These changes are the body's way of easing itself out of life. In hospice, one hospice nurse describes watching relatives hover anxiously over their loved one's chest, waiting for the last breath they've seen in films. But the real last breath is often quiet, ambiguous, and part of a long pattern of pauses and returns. It is not a cliff, but a shoreline. Food, water, and the fear of starving a loved one. Among the most persistent misconceptions is the belief that a dying person must be fed to stay alive. Families bring soups, favorite meals, water bottles, pleading for one more sip. They fear that refusing food means giving up. But end of life workers explain that as the body shuts down, metabolism slows dramatically, hunger and thirst disappear. Forcing food or fluids can cause discomfort, choking, or agitation. What the body needs is not sustenance, it is comfort. One nurse recalled her own grandmother in intensive care, how she tried to solve or shovel food into her mouth out of love and fear. Now, as a professional, she sees the same instinct in families every day. It is an act of devotion, but the one that misunderstands the psychology of dying, the fear of morphine and hastening death. Another misconception is that comfort medications, especially opioids like morphine, speed up dying. Families sometimes resist them, worried that they are choosing death over life. End of life workers gently correct this. Morphine eases the pain. Morphine eases pain and calms the sensation of air hunger. It does not cause death. When someone dies soon after receiving it, it, it is because they were already close to the end. This this medication simply allows them to leave without suffering. The emotional landscapes families don't expect. Death is not only physical, it is emotional, spiritual, relational. Hospice staff describe spiritual Hospice, hospice staff describe how families often arrive under with unresolved conflicts, guilt, or fear. Some avoid the room. Others, others hover anxiously, trying to control every detail. Many are shocked by how long the process takes or how quickly it accelerates. Workers say that the dying process exposes the truth of relationships, the tenderness, the fractures, the unfinished conversations. It is common for families to feel they are doing it wrong, not knowing whether to talk, touch, sit silently, or step away. End of life workers become guides not only for the patient but for everyone gathered around the bed. Why we misunderstand death. The misunderstandings persist because death has been pushed out of everyday life. We know the stages of birth. We do not know the stages of dying. Modern medicine has made death feel like a failure rather than a natural transition. Many people reach adulthood without ever witnessing someone witnessing someone die. So when they finally do, they interpret normal signs, irregular breathing, unresponsiveness, changes in color as emergencies. Hospice workers say this cultural distance fuels fear. It also fuels silence. Families avoid talking about death until it is unavoidable. And by then, shock is sharper. What end of life workers wish we knew. Across interviews, essays, and research, end of life workers share a common hope that we learn to see death as a human process rather than a medical crisis. They emphasize dying is gradual, it has stages, and most of them are normal. Comfort, comfort matters more than more than intervention. The goal is to ease, not prolongation. Families need guidance. Understanding the process reduces fear and conflict. Open conversations help. Talking about death early makes the final days gentler. Dignifying and choice shape the dignity and choice shape the experience. Small acts, adjusting a blanket, dimming a light, holding a hand, carry enormous meaning. The quiet truth. If you ask hospice workers what death looks like, they will describe moments that are surprisingly ordinary. A daughter humming softly, a grandson reading a book in the corner, a nurse smoothing a pillow, a final exhale that sounds like any other breath. They will tell you that death is not an enemy to be defeated, but a threshold to be honored. They will tell you that families often leave the experience changed, not because death has dramatic was dramatic, but because it was deeply human. Okay, guys, here's the second half of B for you. Okay, here you go. The title is "They're at the End," is a phase, a phrase end of life workers use often quietly, almost reverently, because it captures the truth that dying is not a moment, but a presence. It is, it's the stretch of time when the body is letting go, when families gather in a kind of suspended reality, when everything shows or slows down and becomes strangely simple. Since you're working deeply, since you're working deeply with caregivers, families, and emotional terrain of transitions, here is a long narrative essay centered on the phrase, they're at the end. And what end of life workers say we consistently misunderstand. There at the end, what we get wrong about death, according to the people who witness it every day. The most people imagine death as a single instant, a final breath, a whispered goodbye, a dramatic closing of the eyes. But end of life workers know that death is not an instant, it is a place, a landscape, a slow crossing. And most of us arrive at it unprepared, carrying myths that make the journey harder. and it needs to be harder than it needs to be. The quiet reality we rarely see when hospice nurses talk about being there. At the end, they describe rooms that feel suspended in time. The television is usually off. The lights are dim. A family member sits in a chair. They haven't left for hours. The dying person's breathing has changed. Slower, softer. Something or sometimes with long pauses that make everyone hold their own breath. This is part of the dying. This is parts of dying that movies never show. The long, gentle unwinding. The body is doing exactly what it is meant to do. But families often panic, believing something is wrong. End of life workers say this is one of the biggest misconceptions, that dying is chaotic or violent. The truth, in truth, natural death is usually quiet, rhythmic, and deeply human. The myth of fighting death. We talk about death as a battle. We say people lost the fight or gave up. But end of life workers say this language distorts reality. The body is not fighting, it is transitioning. It is converting energy. Withdrawing from outside world, withdrawing from the outside world, turning to inward. One hospice physician said, "People think dying is a failure of medicine. It is not. It is a completion of biology." Families often feel guilt when they stop aggressive treatments, believing they are choosing death. But workers emphasize that comfort care is not surrender. It is a shift in purpose. The goal becomes ease, dignity, and presence, food and water, and the fear of letting go. One of the most painful misunderstandings families carry is a belief that the dying person must be fed to stay alive. They bring soups, favorite meals, bottled water, pleading for one more bite. They fear that refusing food means giving up. End of life workers gently explain that the body's needs change dramatically at the end. Hunger and thirst fade. Digestion slows. Forcing food can cause discomfort, choking, or agitation. The body is not starving, it is shutting down naturally. A hospice nurse once said families think feeding is love, but at the end, comfort is love. The fear of morphine, another misconception that morphine hastens death. Families sometimes resist it, worried that they are choosing comfort over life. Work, Workers explain that morphine eases pain. Give me 1 second, guys. One second. And relieves the terrifying sensation of air hunger. It does not cause death. When someone dies soon after receiving it, it is because they were already close to the end. Morphine doesn't shorten life, it softens suffering. The emotional terrain, one no one warns us about. End of life workers say the emotional landscape of dying is often more complex than the physical one. Families arrive with old wounds, unresolved conflicts, guilt, or fear. Some, however, some hover anxiously, others avoid the room entirely. Many are shocked. Many are shocked by how long the process takes or how quickly it accelerates. Workers describe how dying exposes the truth of relationships. It brings tenderness and fractures to the surface. It forces conversations that were postponed for years. It reveals who can sit in silence and who can cannot bear it. It brings being there at the end is not about witnessing death. It is about witnessing family. The signs we misinterpret. End of life workers say families often misread normal signs of dying as emergencies, irregular breathing, cool molted skin, long pauses between breaths. Withdrawal or unresponsiveness, sudden bursts of clarity or energy. These are not signs of distress, they are signs of transition because most people have never seen a natural death. They interpret these changes as something going wrong. One nurse said people think dying looks like trauma. It doesn't. Trauma is what happens when death is interrupted. Why we get it wrong. We misunderstand death because we rarely see it. Modern life has moved dying out of homes into institutions. We know the stages of labor, but not the stages of dying. We celebrate birth with rituals and preparation. We meet death with fear and silence. End of life workers say this cultural distance creates unnecessary suffering. Families arrive at the bedside without a map, without language, without expectations. They feel loss. They feel afraid. They feel responsible for fixing something that cannot be fixed. What end of life workers wish we knew. Across interviews, stories, and decades of bedside experience, end of life workers share a common hope that we learn to see death as a human process, not a medical failure. They wish we knew dying is gradual. Comfort matters more than intervention. Silence is not abandonment. Touch can touch can speak louder than words. The body knows how to die. Families need guidance, not perfection. Love is expressed through presence, not control. There at the end, if you ask end of life workers what it means to be there at the end, they will tell you about moments that are surprisingly ordinary. A daughter humming softly, a grandson reading in the corner, a nurse adjusting a blanket, a final exhale that sounds like any other breath. They will tell you that death is not an enemy, it is a threshold. They will tell you that families often leave changed not because death was dramatic, but because it was deeply human. Okay, guys. So that is B, and I will be back on shortly with C, whatever that is. I have to decide, so I will let you know. I'm going to take a little break, and I will be back on with C shortly.